Stan exhaled slowly, letting the sterile air of the clinic cling to him as he stepped into the bright sunlight. The warmth on his skin offered a brief reprieve, a fleeting comfort against the cold reality that now loomed over him. The sun, usually a source of solace, felt alien, almost mocking, as if the universe itself was playing a cruel joke. He had promised himself a coffee once it was all over, a small indulgence to punctuate the day's grim events. But as he crossed the hospital parking lot, the idea of coffee seemed distant, irrelevant, a tiny comfort in the face of the colossal weight now resting on his shoulders. Ahead, two boys on BMX bikes looped around security bollards, their carefree laughter a sharp contrast to the heaviness that had settled in his soul. Their energy only highlighted the numbness creeping through him, each step feeling like an immense effort. His gaze wandered to the dirty window of a dry cleaner, where he caught a glimpse of his reflection, pale, hollow-eyed, a man adrift in a sea of despair. The news he had just received was as devastating as he had feared, and now he struggled to piece together the fragments of his life. He leaned heavily against the wall, trying to collect his thoughts. The word cancer echoed in his mind, reverberating off the walls of his consciousness until it was all he could hear. He remembered the doctor's tone, gentle but firm, as though he was delivering the weather report and not a death sentence. Stage 4, the doctor had said, the words hanging in the air like a guillotine poised to drop. The cancer has metastasized to your pelvis and chest. Stan had sat there, numb, barely registering the doctor's explanations of surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. The words survival rate and pain management floated past him, their meanings diluted by the shock that enveloped him. Finally, he had managed to ask, his voice trembling, "You mean I'll probably die?" The doctor had met his gaze, a look of professional sympathy in his eyes. "We're going to do everything we can, Mr. Parker. There's still hope, but it's important to be realistic. We'll focus on managing your pain and giving you the best quality of life possible." Quality of life, Stan had repeated, as if trying to grasp the concept. It sounded so clinical, so detached from the reality of what he was facing. How could there be any quality of life when his days were now numbered? Leaving the clinic, Stan felt a strange detachment from the world around him, as though he were walking through a dream. The laughter of the boys on their bikes grated against his ears, a painful reminder of the carefree days of his youth. How long had it been since he had felt that kind of freedom, that unburdened joy? It seemed like a lifetime ago. Regret gnawed at him for not bringing Susie along. She would have known what questions to ask, would have taken notes, would have been there to hold his hand through the unbearable weight of it all. But she wasn't there, and now he had to navigate this nightmare alone. Stan fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed Susie's number. He needed to hear her voice, to find some anchor in this swirling sea of despair. But the phone rang, and with each unanswered ring, his anxiety grew. Finally, a receptionist answered, her voice clipped and businesslike. "Susie's on vacation today," the receptionist informed him, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Stan's heart sank. Vacation? Susie never took time off. It was unlike her, unsettling in its oddity. Why hadn't she told him? The thought gnawed at him, adding to the already overwhelming sense of dread. He dialed their home number, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried her mobile next, but again, there was no answer. Panic began to set in as he typed out a text, "Call me back as soon as you see this. I need to talk." His thumb hovered over the send button for a moment before he pressed it, the words feeling woefully inadequate. By the time he reached his car, his phone buzzed with a reply. He unlocked the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. Her message was cold, detached. "What's the problem?" Stan stared at the words, his chest tightening. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just busy, or maybe she didn't realize how serious this was. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The woman he had married would have called him immediately, would have been there to support him, to share in the burden of this crushing news. But this this felt like a dismissal. He dialed her number again, desperate to hear her voice, but once more the call went to voicemail. He sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, the loneliness pressing down on him like a physical weight. How had things gotten so distant between them? He replayed the past few months in his mind, searching for the moment when the rift had formed, but it was elusive, like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. His thoughts spiraled as he sat there, his mind racing through the worst-case scenarios. Was she with someone else? The thought had crossed his mind before, in moments of insecurity, but he had always dismissed it, trusting in the bond they had shared for so many years. But now, with her cold response and her absence in his time of need, the doubts began to take root. "Susie, where are you?" he whispered to himself, his voice breaking as he stared at his phone, willing it to ring. But the silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, offering no answers, only more questions. Finally, he started the car, the engine's hum doing little to soothe the turmoil within him. He pulled out of the parking lot, his mind racing with thoughts of Susie, of the cancer of the life he had once known slipping away from him. The promise of coffee forgotten, replaced by the bitter taste of betrayal lingering in his mouth. Susie sat on the train to London, staring out the window, watching the world blur by. Her thoughts were miles away from Stan, buried deep in the anticipation of what lay ahead. The text messages from him had been easy to brush off, a mild annoyance in what she considered her day of freedom. Freedom, the word echoed in her mind, tinged with a bitterness she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Freedom from the mundane, from the constant worry over Stan's health, from the suffocating routine of their marriage. She was on her way to meet Clifford, a friend who had lingered on the periphery of her life for years, someone she had always kept at arm's length, afraid of what crossing that line might mean. But today, all those reservations had crumbled. Clifford had called her, his voice thick with the raw pain of discovering his wife's infidelity, and something inside her had shifted. A connection that had simmered under the surface for so long now felt undeniable, an unspoken attraction that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. As the train rumbled on, Susie's mind wandered back to the last few months with Stan. His illness had cast a shadow over everything, turning their once vibrant life into a series of doctor's appointments, prescriptions, and whispered conversations about next steps. She had tried to be supportive, tried to be the wife she was supposed to be, but the weight of it all had worn her down. Stan's fear, his neediness, his constant presence, it had all become too much. She needed an escape, a breath of air, and Clifford had offered that to her without even knowing it. When she arrived at Euston Station, her phone buzzed with a message from Stan. She glanced at it, the words swimming before her eyes. "Where are you?" "I need to talk." Guilt tugged at her, but she quickly shoved it aside as she caught sight of Clifford waiting for her on the platform. He looked just as she had imagined, lost, vulnerable, his eyes searching the crowd for her. "Susie," Clifford said as she approached, his voice filled with relief. He stepped forward, and they exchanged a polite kiss on the cheek, but the moment lingered a beat too long, their bodies pressed together in an embrace that felt both comforting and dangerous. "Clifford," Susie replied, her voice softer than she intended. She could feel the tension between them, an unspoken current that had always been there but was now electrified by the circumstances. "How are you holding up?" "Barely," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. I didn't know who else to call." "I'm glad you did," she said, and she meant it. There was something thrilling about being needed, about stepping out of her own life and into someone else's for a while. They found a cozy cafe tucked away from the hustle of the station, a small corner of the world where they could hide from everything else. Over lunch, they really talked in a way that Susie hadn't done with anyone in years. Clifford's misery over his shattered marriage resonated with her more deeply than she expected, each word drawing them closer, binding them in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "I don't know how to move on," Clifford confessed, staring into his coffee cup as though it held the answers. "It's like everything I thought I knew about love, about trust. It's all been a lie." Susie reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You're not alone in that," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I've been feeling the same way. For a long time now." Clifford looked up, his eyes searching hers. "Susie," he hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I've always felt something for you, but I never acted on it because I didn't want to ruin what we had. But now, I don't know, everything's changed." A flutter of excitement stirred in Susie's chest, mixed with the dangerous thrill she hadn't felt in years. She knew she should say something, should put an end to this before it went too far, but the pull was too strong. Clifford's vulnerability, his need for her, it was intoxicating, and she couldn't resist it. Hours slipped by like sand through her fingers, and when it was time to part ways, Susie hesitated. The day had been too perfect, too liberating to end. Clifford suggested dinner, and she agreed, telling herself it was just one more meal, nothing more. But deep down she knew better. As they walked through the streets of London, the city's lights flickering like stars against the evening sky, the connection between them deepened. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, becoming more intimate, more revealing with each passing moment. They spoke of things they had never shared with anyone else, secrets and dreams that had been locked away for years. The bond that formed was unlike anything Susie had ever experienced, a connection that made her question everything she had ever known about love, loyalty, and marriage. They ended up at a hotel bar, where Clifford ordered champagne to toast their unexpected day together. The bubbles danced in her glass, mirroring the excitement bubbling inside her. The conversation took on a new tone, filled with confessions and emotions that had been suppressed for far too long. "I can't stop thinking about you," Susie Clifford admitted, his voice trembling with sincerity. "Even when I was with her, it was always you." Susie's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She knew she should stop, should turn back before it was too late, but the pull was too strong. Clifford's gaze locked onto hers, filled with a longing that mirrored her own. When he leaned in to kiss her, she didn't resist. Instead, she surrendered to the moment, letting it carry her away from the life she had known. The kiss was everything she had imagined, tender yet filled with a passion that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. It was a release, a way to escape the mundane, to feel something real and alive. The world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them in their own bubble of forbidden desire. Later, in the privacy of a hotel room, their passion ignited like a wildfire, consuming all reason and restraint. The fear, the guilt, the reality of what they were doing was drowned out by the intoxicating rush of finally giving in to what they had both wanted for so long. They were careful, mindful of the consequences, but in the end, desire overruled caution. Susie knew it was a mistake, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed, but she couldn't deny the thrill of it all, the escape from her mundane existence, the intoxicating sense of being desired. When it was over, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what she had done settling over her like a heavy fog. She had crossed a line, betrayed not just Stan but herself. Yet there was a part of her that felt liberated, free in a way she hadn't been in years. But as the euphoria began to fade, the reality of what she had done started to sink in. How could she ever go back to the life she had known? How could she face Stan, knowing she had betrayed him in the worst possible way? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a stark reminder of the world outside their hotel room. She picked it up, her heart sinking as she saw Stan's name on the screen. Guilt washed over her, but she quickly shoved it aside. She wasn't ready to face the consequences yet, wasn't ready to acknowledge the damage she had done. "Everything okay?" Clifford asked, his voice soft as he turned to look at her. Susie forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just work stuff," she lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. She didn't want to taint their perfect day with the reality waiting for her outside. As she put the phone back down, a cold, gnawing feeling took root in her chest. She had spent the day chasing freedom, but now she was left with a different kind of prison, a prison of her own making, where the walls were built from lies and betrayal. And there was no escaping that. In the dim light of the hotel room, the reality of what they had done began to settle over Susie like a heavy fog. Clifford was already asleep beside her, his breath steady, his arm draped possessively across her waist. Susie lay still, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if it held the answers to the questions swirling in her mind. How had it come to this? The guilt gnawed at her, intertwining with the remnants of the thrill she had felt just hours before. She tried to convince herself that it had been a moment of weakness, a brief escape from the monotony of her life with Stan, but the truth was more complex, more damning. It wasn't just the act, it was the feeling of being seen, being wanted, that had drawn her to Clifford. In that room she had felt alive, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. The excitement, the danger, the thrill of stepping into the unknown, it had all been intoxicating. But now in the aftermath, all that remained was the cold reality of her betrayal. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. What would Stan think if he knew? The thought of his face, twisted with pain and betrayal, was almost too much to bear. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but the realization that she had crossed a line she could never retreat from was overwhelming. Back at home, Stan sat in their bedroom, surrounded by the silence that had become his constant companion. The emptiness of the house seemed to echo his own feelings of isolation. The house had once been filled with laughter, warmth, and the bustling noise of their shared life. Now it was just a shell, much like he felt a hollowed-out version of the man he used to be. For weeks he had been trying to piece together the fragments of his life, desperately searching for something to hold on to. He had known something was wrong. He could feel it in the way Susie had started pulling away, in the way her eyes no longer met his with the same warmth they once held. But he had been too afraid to confront it, too scared to acknowledge the possibility that his wife, the woman he had built his life around, could be drifting away from him. As he sat there, memories of their life together flooded his mind, the laughter they once shared, the small gestures of love that had been their foundation. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the growing realization that Susie had already moved on. The signs were all there, plain as day: the distant conversations, the unexplained absences, the sudden interest in new clothes and makeup. She had found someone else, someone who made her feel alive in a way he no longer could. Determined not to wallow in self-pity, Stan decided to take control of the little time he had left. If Susie was gone, then he needed to find a way to live for himself, however long that might be. He packed a bag and drove to the Lake District, seeking solace in the familiar landscape that had always brought him peace. The drive was long, giving him plenty of time to reflect. He tried to push Susie from his mind, but she lingered there, a shadow that refused to be cast aside. When he finally arrived, the crisp air of the mountains filled his lungs, and for the first time in days, he felt a sliver of calm. The next few days were spent hiking, his legs burning as he pushed his body to its limits. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction, a way to outrun the pain that gnawed at his bones and the thoughts that haunted his mind. He climbed higher and higher, as if the elevation could somehow lift the weight of his worries. Along the way, he met two young women, Bella and Simone, whose youthful exuberance was a balm to his weary soul. Their laughter was infectious, and for a moment, Stan found himself smiling, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. The girls kept him company on his climb to the top of Scaffold Pike, their energy reminding him of a time when life was still full of possibilities. They were kind, offering to help him when the climb became too steep, and he was grateful for their presence. But as they reached the summit, the weight of everything he had been trying to escape came crashing down on him. The view was breathtaking, the world spread out before him like a vast, endless canvas. But instead of feeling triumphant, he felt empty. This was supposed to be a moment of victory, of clarity, but all he could think about was the life he had lost, the love that had slipped through his fingers. As they began their descent, his hip gave out and he crumpled to the ground. The pain was sharp, intense, but it paled in comparison to the ache in his heart. He knew, in that moment, that he was done. There was no more running, no more hiding from the truth. With a heavy heart, he thanked Bella and Simone for their companionship and sent them on their way, insisting he would be fine. But he knew he wouldn't make it down the mountain, not this time. As he sat there, the world around him quiet and still, he thought of Susie not with anger, but with a deep, aching sadness. He had loved her with everything he had, but it hadn't been enough. And now he was facing the end alone, just as he had feared. Meanwhile, Susie sat in the train back to their small town, her mind reeling from the events of the day. She had made a decision, a selfish one, she knew, but it was one she couldn't take back. As the train sped through the night, she wondered what she would say to Stan when she saw him. Would he be able to tell? Would he see the guilt etched on her face, the betrayal that now stained their marriage? She knew she had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The question was, what would she do now? The final day of Stan's journey had begun with the quiet resolve that had carried him through the past few days. He woke before dawn, the sky still a deep indigo, as he prepared for the last leg of his trek. The mountains loomed above him, their peaks shrouded in mist, as if daring him to reach the summit. He had always found solace in the mountains, a place where the vastness of nature could drown out the noise in his head. But today there was a weight in his chest that no amount of fresh air could lift. As he began his ascent, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Each step was a battle, his body protesting with every movement, but he pushed on, driven by the need to find some semblance of peace before it was too late. The pain in his hip had been growing worse, a dull throb that had turned into a sharp, persistent ache. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the rhythm of his breath, the crunch of gravel underfoot. But the pain was relentless, a constant reminder of his failing body. Bella and Simone, the two young women he had met along the way, were a few steps ahead, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Their energy was infectious, a stark contrast to the exhaustion that weighed him down. They called back to him, encouraging him to keep going, and he forced a smile, not wanting to dampen their spirits. He didn't want them to see how much he was struggling, how every step felt like an insurmountable obstacle. When they finally reached the summit, Stan paused, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he took in the view. The world stretched out before him, vast and endless, the mountains rolling into the distance like waves frozen in time. It was breathtaking, a sight that should have filled him with awe, but all he felt was a hollow emptiness, a sense of being adrift in a world that had moved on without him. For a brief moment he felt a flicker of triumph, a small victory in the face of everything that had been taken from him. But it was fleeting, swallowed up by the overwhelming realization that this too would soon be lost. The clarity he had sought, the peace he had hoped to find at the summit, eluded him, leaving behind only the crushing weight of his reality. As they began their descent, the pain in his hip became unbearable. Each step sent a jolt of agony through his body, the ground beneath him seeming to shift and sway as if it were trying to throw him off balance. He tried to hide it, to keep moving, but his body had reached its limit. One misstep was all it took. His leg buckled, and he crumpled to the ground, the world spinning around him in a dizzying blur of pain and fear. Bella and Simone rushed to his side, their faces etched with concern as they tried to help him up. But Stan knew it was over, knew that he couldn't go any further. He thanked them, his voice strained, insisting that they go on without him. "I'll be fine," he lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They hesitated, unwilling to leave him, but he was adamant. "I just need a moment to rest," he assured them, though he knew he wouldn't be getting up again. Reluctantly, they obeyed, casting worried glances back at him as they continued down the trail. As their figures disappeared from view, Stan let out a shaky breath, the last of his strength leaving him. He was alone now, the vast emptiness of the mountains closing in around him. The pain was all-consuming, but even that began to fade as the cold crept into his bones, numbing him to everything but the steady, relentless march of time. When the rescuers finally found him, hours had passed. Stan was barely conscious, his body curled up against the unforgiving ground, his breath shallow and labored. They worked quickly, their voices calm but urgent, as they assessed his injuries and prepared to transport him to the hospital. But Stan's mind was elsewhere, lost in the fog of pain and exhaustion. He was dimly aware of the helicopter's arrival, the deafening roar of its blades cutting through the stillness of the mountains, but he was too far gone to care. Meanwhile, Susie sat at home, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her like a physical burden. She had tried to distract herself, throwing herself into mundane tasks, but nothing could quiet the storm raging inside her. The guilt was overwhelming, a constant reminder of the betrayal she had committed. She couldn't escape the thoughts that plagued her, couldn't silence the voice that whispered, over and over, that she had made a terrible mistake. When the call came from the police, it felt like a punch to the gut. Stan had been found on the mountain, critically injured. The words didn't seem real, as if they belonged to someone else's life, not hers. She barely registered the details, her mind reeling as she grabbed her keys and rushed out the door. The drive to the hospital was a blur, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. By the time she arrived, it was the dead of night. The hospital was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh, sterile glow over everything. Susie's footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as she hurried to the ICU, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Stan lying there, pale and motionless, hooked up to a tangle of machines. The sight of him, so fragile and broken, shattered the last of her defenses. The lies, the betrayal, the guilt, it all came crashing down on her, overwhelming in its intensity. She had done this, she had driven him to this, had pushed him to the brink with her selfishness and deceit. How could she ever make amends? How could she ever face him, knowing what she had done? As she sat by his bedside watching the rise and fall of his labored breathing, tears streamed down her face, unchecked. She didn't deserve his forgiveness, she didn't deserve to be there by his side after everything she had done. But when Stan opened his eyes and saw her, a weak smile touched his lips. "I'm glad you came, Susie," he whispered, his voice frail and filled with a tenderness that broke her heart. His words were a knife to her soul, cutting through the layers of guilt and shame that had built up inside her. How could he forgive her so easily? How could he still find it in himself to care, after all the pain she had caused him? Susie couldn't hold back the sobs that racked her body, the weight of her actions crashing down on her with relentless force. She grasped his hand, her tears falling onto his skin, wishing with all her heart that she could take back the last few days, that she could undo the hurt she had caused. But she knew it was too late. The damage had been done, and all she could do now was be there for him, in whatever time he had left. She stayed by his side through the long, dark hours of the night, her heart heavy with regret, knowing that she had lost the man she loved, knowing that she had no one to blame but herself. Stan's last words echoed in Susie's mind long after his heart had stopped. "I'm glad you came, Susie." The simplicity of his statement cut deeper than any accusation, any angry outburst could have. It was forgiveness undeserved, unearned, and it broke her in a way nothing else could. How could he forgive her when she had done the unforgivable? The guilt was a living thing inside her, gnawing at her insides, turning every breath into a reminder of her betrayal. In the days following Stan's death, Susie moved through life like a ghost herself, haunted by the memories of what she had done. The house they had shared was no longer a refuge but a prison, every room a stark reminder of the love she had squandered. She would wake in the middle of the night, expecting to find him beside her, only to be confronted with the cold, empty space where he should have been. His voice lingered in the silence, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, accusing her in the quiet hours of the morning. One evening, as she stood in their bedroom, her gaze fell upon a photograph of them from happier times. They were laughing, their faces lit with joy, a world away from the despair that had consumed them in the end. Susie reached out, her fingers brushing the glass, and suddenly the dam inside her broke. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure anguish hurling the frame across the room. It shattered against the wall, the pieces scattering like the fragments of her heart. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. She knew she had to leave. The walls of their home, once filled with love and laughter, had become suffocating, closing in on her with every passing day. She sold the house, the place where they had built a life together, where they had dreamed of a future that would now never come to pass. She couldn't bear to stay in the city that held so many memories, each one a knife to her soul. London called to her, a place where she could disappear, where she could start over, even though she knew she could never truly escape her past. But London was no refuge. No matter how far she ran, she couldn't outrun the ghost of Stan. He was there, in the quiet moments, in the dreams that turned into nightmares. She would see his face in the crowd, hear his voice in the rustle of leaves, feel his presence in the chill of the night air. The guilt was her constant companion, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Susie threw herself into her new life, trying to drown out the memories with work, with distractions, with anything that could fill the void inside her. But nothing worked. The more she tried to forget, the more the past clung to her, refusing to let go. She couldn't escape the realization that she had destroyed the only person who had truly loved her, and for what? A fleeting moment of passion, a brief escape from the mundane? The recklessness of her actions now seemed incomprehensible, as if someone else had taken over her body and made decisions she would never have made in her right mind. Months passed, but the ache inside her only grew. She avoided old friends, those who knew her as Stan's wife, unable to face their questions, their pity, their judgment. Loneliness settled in, as inescapable as her guilt, and she began to realize that she had not only lost Stan but herself as well. Who was she without him? The woman who had betrayed him was not the woman she had thought she was. She had become a stranger, lost in a labyrinth of her own making, with no way out. One rainy afternoon, Susie found herself wandering the streets of London, aimless and adrift. The rain soaked through her coat, her hair plastered to her face, but she barely noticed. She found herself at a small, nondescript church, the kind of place she would have walked past without a second glance in her old life. But now, something drew her in. She stepped inside, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft thud. The air was cool, the light dim, the space empty save for a few rows of pews and an altar at the far end. Susie sat down in the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't religious, had never been one for prayer, but in that moment, she felt the need to reach out to anything that could offer her a shred of peace. She closed her eyes, the words coming unbidden, a whisper in the silence. "I'm sorry," she breathed, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The apology was for Stan, for herself, for everything that had led her to this moment. But there was no answer, no sign that her words had been heard, only the quiet, suffocating weight of her guilt. As she sat there, the rain tapping against the windows, Susie knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be found in the words of others, but in the reckoning she had to face within herself. The path to redemption, to some semblance of peace, would be long and painful, a journey she would have to undertake alone. But for the first time, she felt a small flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative belief that she could begin to atone for her sins, to find a way back to the person she had once been, before the lies, before the betrayal. It wouldn't be easy. The scars left by Stan's death, by her actions, would never fully heal, but perhaps in time she could learn to live with them, to let them remind her of the lessons she had learned at such a terrible cost. As she left the church, the rain still falling in sheets, she felt a strange sense of resolve settle over her. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was one she had to walk. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to forgive herself, to fill the hollow emptiness that had consumed her, and to finally put Stan's ghost to rest. But as she stepped back into the London streets, one thing was clear: she could never undo what she had done. The past would always haunt her, but she had a choice: to let it destroy her, or to find a way to live with it, to honor Stan's memory by becoming someone he could have been proud of. The reckoning had begun, and Susie knew there was no turning back. Years later, when Susie received the invitation to Clifford's memorial service, her hands trembled as she held the elegant envelope. The past, which she had tried so hard to bury, surged back with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of her. How could she face this? The mere thought of returning to those memories, those mistakes, was enough to make her want to retreat back into the safety of her new, carefully constructed life. But something deep inside her, perhaps a sense of duty, or maybe guilt, compelled her to go. The day of the memorial was gray and overcast, the sky heavy with unspoken sorrow. As Susie approached St. George's Cathedral in Southwark, she was struck by the grandeur of the building, its imposing facade a stark contrast to the broken man she had known. Clifford had been important, far more than she had realized, his life touching countless others in ways she never imagined. The cathedral was packed with mourners, over 500 people, all gathered to pay their respects to a man who had clearly left a significant mark on the world. As Susie stepped inside, the weight of her past sins pressed down on her, each step heavier than the last. The air inside the cathedral was thick with emotion, the kind of collective grief that was almost palpable. She felt out of place, like an intruder in this sea of sorrow. How could she, of all people, dare to mourn him? Her betrayal, long buried, now felt raw and exposed, as if the very walls of the cathedral knew her secret. She found a seat near the back, hoping to remain unnoticed, but her heart pounded in her chest as the service began. The eulogies were beautiful, painting Clifford as a man of integrity, strength, and compassion. Each word was a dagger to Susie's heart, a reminder of the man she had betrayed, the man she had never truly known. The Clifford she had shared stolen moments with was not the Clifford being remembered here. That man had been strong, caring, devoted to his family, a far cry from the vulnerable, broken soul she had known during their affair. As the speakers recounted stories of his kindness, his generosity, Susie felt herself sinking deeper into her seat, the guilt weighing her down. How had she missed this? How had she been so blinded by her own selfish needs that she hadn't seen the real Clifford, the man who had been loved by so many? Her own loneliness and desperation had clouded her judgment, leading her to seek solace in someone who had been equally lost. But now, hearing the truth of who he had been, Susie felt a crushing sense of loss, not just for Clifford but for herself, for the person she had once been, before everything had gone so terribly wrong. As the service drew to a close, Clifford's eldest son stepped forward to deliver the final eulogy. His voice was steady, but it trembled with emotion as he spoke of his father's love, his unwavering support, and the way he had held their family together through every trial. Tears welled in Susie's eyes as she listened, the depth of Clifford's impact on his family laid bare for all to see. She realized with painful clarity that she had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in his life, a distraction from the pain he had been carrying. When the service ended, Susie remained seated, her mind reeling from the revelations of the day. The congregation began to disperse, people whispering condolences, hugging one another, their grief shared and mutual. Susie, however, felt utterly alone, disconnected from the people around her. She had no one to share her sorrow with, no one who could understand the tangled web of emotions she was caught in. The thought of approaching Clifford's family, of expressing her condolences, seemed impossible. What could she say? That she was sorry for the loss of a man she had betrayed? That she had known a different Clifford, one who had been lost and searching, just like her? Just as she was about to slip out unnoticed, a woman approached her, a striking woman in her 50s, with a composed expression that only barely concealed the pain beneath. It was Clifford's wife, Helen. Susie's heart lurched, her mouth suddenly dry as she tried to muster the strength to speak. What could she possibly say? But before she could find the words, Helen spoke first. "You were Susie, weren't you?" Helen's voice was soft, her tone devoid of accusation. It was a simple question, yet it held a world of understanding. Susie nodded, her voice caught in her throat. I didn't mean to intrude. I just wanted to pay my respects," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. Helen studied her for a moment, her eyes searching Susie's face as if trying to read the truth behind her words. There was no anger in her gaze, only a deep, weary sadness. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded slightly, her expression softening. "Clifford spoke of you," Helen said, her voice tinged with melancholy. "Not often, but enough for me to know he was grateful for your friendship, even if it came at a difficult time for both of you." Susie's breath caught in her throat, tears welling in her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I was lost. And so was he, but I never meant to." Helen held up a hand, stopping Susie mid-sentence. "We all make mistakes," she said quietly, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "And sometimes, we find ourselves in places we never intended to be. But Clifford, he found peace in the end. I think, in some way, he forgave himself. Maybe it's time you did too." Susie was stunned, the weight of Helen's words settling over her like a blanket. Forgiveness, something she had never been able to give herself. But here was this woman, the one person who had every right to hate her, offering her a chance at absolution. "Thank you," Susie whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I don't deserve your kindness, but thank you." Helen reached out and gently squeezed Susie's hand. "None of us are perfect, Susie. We all carry our burdens. But we can choose to let them go, to move forward." With that, Helen gave Susie one last look, a look filled with a quiet strength that Susie could only hope to find within herself one day, before turning and walking away. Susie watched her go, her heart heavy yet strangely lightened by the encounter. The conversation had given her something she had never expected to find at Clifford's memorial, a sense of closure. As she left the cathedral, stepping out into the cold London air, she felt a new resolve settling within her. The past would always be a part of her, a chapter of her life that could never be unwritten. But perhaps with time she could learn to forgive herself, just as Helen had suggested. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in years, Susie felt the stirrings of hope. As she walked through the crowded streets of London, her thoughts turned to Stan, to Clifford, and to the woman she had been. She wasn't that person anymore, she couldn't be. The pain she had caused, the lives she had touched in ways both good and bad, had shaped her into someone new, someone who had learned the hard way what it meant to truly live, to truly love, to truly love. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start the process of healing, to begin a new chapter in her life, one not defined by guilt, but by the lessons learned from it. After the service, Susie stepped out into the cold London air, the sharp chill biting at her skin as she pulled her coat tighter around herself. The city hummed with life around her, people rushing to and fro, cars honking in the distance, but for Susie, everything felt strangely muted, as if she were walking through a dream. The weight of the past few years, the choices she had made, and the people she had lost pressed down on her, but there was something else there too, a strange, unexpected sense of closure. As she walked aimlessly through the streets, her mind drifted back to the service, to the faces of Clifford's family, the strength in Helen's words, and the realization that, in the end, everything she had done had led her to this moment. She had lost so much: her husband Stan, who had loved her despite everything, Clifford, who had been both a source of comfort and a reminder of her failures, and most of all, her sense of self. But as the wind whipped around her, carrying away the last remnants of the day's emotions, Susie realized that in losing it all, she had found something more precious. She paused on the sidewalk, her breath forming small clouds in the air as she exhaled slowly. The guilt that had clung to her like a shroud for so long was still there, but it was different now, lighter, more bearable. She had spent so much time punishing herself for the past, for the decisions that had led to Stan's final days being filled with loneliness and betrayal. But standing there, in the heart of London, Susie understood that the time for self-flagellation was over. She had been loved, and she had loved in return, in the best way she knew how. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember the good moments, those fleeting instances when she had felt truly connected to Stan, before the cancer, before the infidelity. His laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the warmth of his hand in hers during those rare moments of peace. These memories, once a source of pain, now felt like a balm, soothing the wounds she had inflicted on herself. As she continued walking, Susie's thoughts turned to Clifford. Their relationship had been built on mutual desperation, two lost souls seeking comfort in each other, but it had not been without its moments of genuine connection. In Clifford, she had found someone who understood her in ways that no one else had, someone who had shared her pain and her guilt. Their time together, though brief and marred by the wrongness of it all, had given her a sense of purpose when everything else seemed to be falling apart. "I loved them both," she whispered to herself, the words slipping out before she could stop them. And it was true. She had loved Stan, the man who had stood by her side for so many years, and she had loved Clifford, the man who had helped her navigate the darkness when Stan's light had started to fade. But love was complicated, messy, and rarely did it follow the neat lines that society tried to impose on it. A small cafe caught her eye, its warm light spilling out onto the street, and she decided to go in. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of conversation greeted her as she stepped inside, offering a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. She ordered a coffee, black, and found a seat by the window, watching the world go by as she wrapped her hands around the warm cup. As she sipped her coffee, Susie allowed herself to think about the future for the first time in what felt like forever. There was nothing tying her down anymore, no expectations, no obligations. She was free to rebuild her life, to find peace on her own terms. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Where would she go from here? The possibilities seemed endless, but for once that didn't fill her with dread. "Maybe I'll travel," she mused quietly, imagining herself exploring new cities, new countries, far away from the memories of London and everything it held. Or perhaps she would find a small town, a place where no one knew her, where she could start over, free from the shadows of her past. The specifics didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she had a choice, that she could decide how the next chapter of her life would unfold. "You have to let go, Susie," she thought, hearing Helen's voice in her mind, echoing the words spoken at the memorial. You have to forgive yourself. The memory of Helen's kindness, her quiet strength, was something Susie would carry with her for the rest of her life. In that brief exchange, Helen had offered Susie something she had never thought she deserved: a chance to move forward, to find peace. It was a gift, one she intended to cherish. Finishing her coffee, Susie left the cafe, feeling lighter than she had in years. The sky was beginning to clear, patches of blue breaking through the gray, and for the first time in a long time, Susie felt as though she could breathe freely. The burden of her past was still there, but it no longer felt insurmountable. She had faced her demons, confronted her guilt, and while the road to healing would be long, she knew she was finally on the right path. Susie continued her walk through the streets of London. She felt a sense of determination welling up inside her, a resolve to take control of her life in a way she never had before. The memories of Stan and Clifford lingered in her mind, not as haunting reminders of her failures, but as chapters of a story that had led her to this very moment. The mistakes, the pain, and even the love she had shared with them had all been part of a journey that was now leading her towards something new. She stopped at a small bookstore she had passed by many times before, but never entered. Drawn in by the scent of old paper and the promise of undiscovered worlds hidden within the pages of the books lining the shelves, Susie felt an urge to explore. She walked through the aisles, running her fingers over the spines of the books, feeling a connection to the stories within. Each one was a testament to the human experience, filled with its own moments of joy, sorrow, triumph, and failure, much like her own life. Finally, she picked up a novel with a simple, unassuming cover. It wasn't a story of grand adventure or epic romance, but something quieter, more introspective, a tale of a woman who, much like herself, was searching for meaning in the aftermath of loss. Susie purchased the book and decided to take it to the nearby park to read. The simple act of choosing a book, of allowing herself to be absorbed in someone else's story, felt like a step toward reclaiming her own narrative. At the park, she found a secluded bench beneath an old oak tree and sat down, the gentle rustling of leaves above her providing a soothing backdrop as she opened the book and began to read. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Susie lost herself in the words on the page, her mind transported to a world where the past didn't weigh her down. As the hours passed, the sky shifted from a dull gray to a soft golden hue as the sun began to set. Susie closed the book, her heart lighter, her spirit rejuvenated. The park had emptied out, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the gentle breeze that whispered through the trees. She looked up at the sky, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting the world in shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful ending to the day, a reminder that every ending was also a beginning. Susie stood up, taking a deep breath, and began walking toward the exit of the park. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. There was a freedom in not knowing, in embracing the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt and regret, but there would also be moments of joy, of discovery, and of love. As she left the park, Susie decided that she would no longer run from her past. She would carry the memories of Stan and Clifford with her, not as burdens, but as reminders of the love she had shared, the lessons she had learned, and the person she had become. She would take that love and channel it into something new, whether it was a new relationship, a new passion, or simply a new way of living. She was ready to start again, to write the next chapter of her life with intention and purpose. The streets of London seemed different now, not as cold or distant, but filled with possibility. Susie walked with her head held high, her heart open to whatever the future might bring. She was no longer the woman she had been, lost, searching, filled with guilt. She was someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. As she turned the corner onto her street, Susie smiled to herself. She had found closure, not in the way she had expected, but in the way she needed. And with that closure came the understanding that life was meant to be lived, fully and without regret. She had loved and been loved, and now it was time to love herself enough to move forward. And so, with the setting sun at her back and the promise of a new day ahead, Susie stepped into her future, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that she was finally at peace with her past.